We just might have time for a little more. I might add a little more to this because I asked Pastor Joel to go a little longer this time. Told him to slow down. Okay. We're on to chapter 8 now. We're a couple chapters behind. I don't know how we're going to catch up, but we'll see what we can do. So this chapter is relevant to idols. Oh no, idols. We don't have any idols in London, do we? So, our commentators say this very short chapter is very, very closely related to the subsequent 2 chapters plus a verse. Our commentators say that there is a particular unity here, there, however obscure that may appear to be. That we have gone from the unity of the flesh in chapter 7 to the unity of the church in chapter 8. And we have gone from being considerate of your marriage partner to being considerate of other crackers in your church. Crackers or Christians, whatever. Since the waiving of your personal liberty or rights is also properly called love. Now, you quizzers probably think that this little chapter on idols is pretty irrelevant to you. Irrelevant since us maple and bacon Canadians don't worship idols of their ancient kind. No. Yet that is not entirely the case. Yes, you too are idol factories, as Calvin likes to call you. But first, before we get into that, let's get to some archaeological background on these idols and on these sacrifices. So, an archaeologist and commentator of ours, Dr. Mayer, says that there were at least 16 temples and shrines in Corinth back then. Some with dining rooms for eating the meat sacrifices dedicated to their imaginary idols. And 1/3 of that meat sacrifice got burnt to smithereens. Another 1/3 of that meat sacrifice went back to the person that offered it. And then 1/3 of that sacrifice went to the priest to do as he wished. And sometimes what the priest did, if he had a lot of meat in stock, and they didn't have any freezers, they'd sell it in the marketplace. Take it to the marketplace, unload it for cold cash. So, he would sell it as holy food. And oh yeah, holy food would fetch a far better price, of course, because it was holy, right? Since that food had met certain purity standards. And Paul suggests that real crackers know that all that purity stuff was just holy hooey. In verse 8, that there ain't no stinking difference. But Paul cautions against buying that supposedly holy stuff, or even accepting that stuff which was often given away on idol holidays that they had back then. But mostly against eating that stuff in their pagan temples, since others might be misled into thinking that you endorse their holy hooey. And as a result, they might endorse that holy hooey themselves, with serious spiritual consequences, with the result of offending a Holy Spirit. But what sort of holy hooey do we have in our day and age, right? What sort? Well, how about halal? Yeah, Muslim food. What about kosher food? Yeah, what about Jewish food? Foods regarded as holy by Muslims and Jews. Well, how do they make it holy? Well, for example, just before a turkey is killed at the meat factory, Maple Leaf Meat Factory, there's a couple of moms there praying for these turkeys just before they're executed. that makes them holy. Okay? What makes Jewish food holy? Well, that it hasn't been contaminated. The meat hasn't been contaminated by milk or something of that sort. So, that food has done nothing, absolutely nothing, to earn that holiness. And nothing holy at all may be imputed to that food either. Put inside that food. Nothing may be infused in that food either, as Catholics might suggest. Rather, that holy food, the holy food, drink, and washing of Jesus are all the stuff that really matters now. And we'll see that in Hebrews 9:10. And even then, that stuff only matters in a memorial sense. Oh, we just had a memorial, didn't we? As we shall see in chapters 10 and 11. And that literal stuff is, the literal sense of that stuff is completely finished. You see that elsewhere in John, which we'll be studying next year. But perhaps I'm being too critical, huh? Not. So let's get to some textual criticism here. Okay. Now, according to Zuntz, good old Zuntz again, only that manuscript called P46 gets verse 3 right of this chapter. And a good many critics are convinced by his argument. Convinced, since the context of this chapter indicates as much. But our NIV version, edited by the International Bible Society, is not yet convinced. I expect they will be in the next version. And to that end, verse 3 of our NIV should have read, "But whoever loves is known by God." Yet it seems our NIV has got one too many GPMs in there at present. What's a GPM? Anybody remember that? Gods per minute? Gods per minute. So it actually says, whoever loves God is known by God. Well, we know better than that. God knows everybody, whether they love him or not, right? But what this means is that you don't necessarily have to love God in order to be known by God, which is pretty obvious, isn't it? Yet the operative point of this verse is that God loves those who do love, especially those who live out of love for him. And we heard about that special grace in the service this morning, rather than just mere common grace. For those, lovers will end up living with him forever. And then, our next verse says, "There is no God but one," which is a cop off Deuteronomy back in the Old Testament. And I like that translation of the NIV. However, the King James Version says, "There's no other God but one." But that other thing just seems to be confusing, doesn't it? As if there is another God. And it should be pretty obvious that there are no other gods. And it should be pretty obvious that there is only one objective Lord that is only possible to have without having utter chaos in this universe. And there is no subjective here, so it's not as if there are some subjective gods in mind here. So, having some holy respect for the meatballs offered to other gods is rather a moot point for us crackers, or Christians as the case may be. It goes without thinking. We couldn't care less about other gods. However, we are told that a cracker's total indifference to their flying spaghetti god should not be exercised in public either, in verse 10. Since your total indifference may be misinterpreted by your fellow crackers. Since your dull indifference may be blindly seen as an endorsement of their flying spaghetti god. And as a result, fellow crackers may then grant some token endorsement to their spaghetti god, or chocolate bunny if you're a VeggieTale fan. And they would thereby be sinning as a result. A sin that you would now be an accomplice in. A sin which often appeared to accompany fornication, as we'll see in chapter 10. And we saw back in Acts 15, of course, with the first council, where that was the very first council, where they spoke about these foods offered to idols and fornication and circumcision. But apart from that unintentional endorsement, may you dine with those noodleheads privately. Well, yeah, sure. But don't be making a habit of dining that way. Making a habit of dining like Barnabas and Peter did while in Antioch, if you remember Galatians 2. Dining as Levitical priests along with those other uppity Jews that I mentioned earlier. Endorsing the Jewish priesthood when it was no longer relevant. Now, let's get a little more relevant here once again. This morning, I thought, I'm going to make this a little more relevant. And I popped down to the McDonald's down the street, which was the first McDonald's in London. Okay. And I'm going to make this a little more relevant for you. A similar endorsement may be seen by dining on fish on Friday, as Catholics do. Why do they do that? Well, let's see. On Good Friday, the flesh was crucified for us. So, let's be real pious here, and let's honor the flesh of Christ on Friday. So, Catholics made a rule. Let's not eat flesh on Friday. Of course. Let's have fish instead. This is not flesh. Right? So, McDonald's capitalized on that. Yeah, we can nail a lot of Catholics here. Cool. So, this is still a Catholic tradition. No fish on Friday. And you'll see fish fries as well. Yeah, fish fries. Just to promote what? Why? Because they're so much more pious because they don't have fish on Friday. However, they do have fish on Friday. They don't have flesh on Friday, pardon me. However, you are allowed by Catholics, by the Catholic Church, to eat meat if you do other pious deeds, if you perform penance in some other manner. If you're more charitable on Friday, then you can eat flesh. So, that's the background behind that. And if you eat fish with them, you would be endorsing their sense of piety, their sense of penance. Is that proper? I think their sense of penance is pretty warped. I think they're totally lacking in the concept of grace being sufficient for you, as we heard this morning. So, also, Calvin mentions not to eat flesh on Friday if it offends a former Catholic. Whoa, Calvin was in on that too. So, why? Since those former Catholics who might be with you might still be whacked out to some extent. See, Calvin still has a heart. He says, don't offend them as well. So, if you're dining with Catholics, spaghetti might be a better option, with or without meatballs. And you can read the rest there, which are other ideas in not offending others.